Chapter 19. Brooms and Brilliance. Mrs. Brockett stood in the parlour, her tall figure framed by tattered drapes that once might have been considered fashionable. She clapped her hands sharply, summoning her family with the urgency of a general mustering reluctant troops. "Today we shall embark upon a grand endeavour," she declared, her dark brown hair piled high in a style that defied both gravity and good taste. "Marianne's intellectual deficiencies have plagued this family long enough. It is our duty, nay, our obligation, to rectify this most grievous flaw." Marianne blinked, her light brown hair falling over eyes that held a perpetual look of pleasant surprise. "Oh, are we having a game, Mother?" Isabella smirked, notebook in hand. "Indeed, Marianne, a most enlightening game." She dipped her quill into the inkwell, poised to record the day's absurdities under the guise of chronicling her mother's genius. "Mabel!" Mrs. Brockett barked, her voice slicing through the air. "Fetch a broom and attend us at once!" From the shadows of the corridor, Mabel emerged, broom in hand, and a scowl firmly etched on her face. "Aye, ma'am, though I reckon the broom's better suited to sweepin' than chasin' off dimness." Mrs. Brockett ignored the insolence. "You shall brandish it at any sign of Marianne's affliction. Perhaps a physical manifestation will drive out the vapours clouding her mind." Mr. Brockett peered over his newspaper, arching an eyebrow. "An interesting hypothesis, my dear. Shall we also shake a rattle to ward off ill humours?" "Your sarcasm is hardly constructive, Henry," she snapped. "Now, to the first exercise. Marianne, recite the alphabet. Backwards." Marianne's face brightened. "Oh, what fun! Let me see. Z... X... No, that's not right. Perhaps it starts with a Q." Mabel snorted, tapping the broom handle on the floor. "Looks like the dimness is putting up a fight, ma'am." Mrs. Brockett shot her a withering glance. "Silence, girl! Marianne, concentrate! Isabella, are you documenting this?" "Every brilliant moment," Isabella replied dryly, scribbling a particularly unflattering caricature of her mother in the margins. Catherine sat quietly by the window, her journal open but untouched. She gazed outside, no doubt lost in some fanciful daydream, utterly detached from the farce unfolding around her. "Perhaps a mathematical challenge will stimulate her faculties," Mrs. Brockett mused. "Marianne, if we have 5 apples and take away 2, how many remain?" Marianne frowned thoughtfully. "Well, that depends. Were the apples green or red?" "What on earth does that matter?" Mrs. Brockett exclaimed, exasperation creeping into her voice. "Green apples are sour, so one might not want to keep them," Marianne explained earnestly. "But if they're red, then—" Mabel swung the broom in a mock attempt to swat at the invisible dimness around Marianne's head. "Begging your pardon, but I think the dimness is dodging me." Isabella hid a grin behind her notebook. "Mother, perhaps Mabel requires a larger instrument. A mop, perhaps." "Don't be ridiculous," Mrs. Brockett huffed. "The issue is Marianne's stubborn refusal to apply herself. We must escalate our efforts." Mr. Brockett folded his newspaper with deliberate care. "Penelope, might I suggest a more conventional approach? Education, perhaps." "Nonsense. Traditional methods have failed. It is time for innovation." She began arranging a mismatched assortment of objects on the table: a chipped teacup, a tarnished candlestick, a frayed ribbon. "Marianne, create a story using these items. Let us assess your creative faculties." Marianne clapped her hands. "Oh, I love stories! Once upon a time, there was a candlestick who wished to be a ribbon." Mabel leaned on the broom, feigning deep contemplation. "Sounds like a tale that'll light up the room." Mrs. Brocket's patience wore thinner than the threadbare carpet. "This is hopeless. Isabella, have you noted the impediments we face?" "Meticulously," Isabella replied, her pen scratching out yet another sardonic remark. "Perhaps the issue lies not with Marianne, but with the clarity of your instructions," Mr. Brocket suggested mildly. Mrs. Brocket whirled on him. "Are you implying that I am to blame for this debacle?" "Not at all, my dear. Merely observing that perhaps your methods are as effective as extinguishing a fire with a sieve." She drew herself up to her full height. "If you are not part of the solution, Henry, then you are part of the precipitate." Isabella choked back a laugh. "I believe you mean problem, Mother." "I know what I said," Mrs. Brocket snapped, cheeks flushing. "Mabel, stop lounging about and make yourself useful. Go and dust something." Mabel raised an eyebrow. "But, ma'am, ain't that what I'm doing here with the broom?" "Enough! This insubordination is intolerable." She turned back to Marianne. "We shall proceed to a more vigorous exercise. Follow me to the drawing-room." They trailed after her, a reluctant procession. The drawing-room was no better than the parlour. Faded upholstery, a cracked mirror, and the lingering scent of neglect. "Now, Marianne, balance this book on your head and recite a poem." Marianne placed the dusty tome atop her head, swaying precariously. "Twinkle, twinkle, little goat?" Mabel coughed pointedly. "Seems the dimness is setting in deeper." Mrs. Brocket glared daggers at her. "Perhaps if someone wasn't constantly interrupting, we might make progress." Isabella tapped her chin thoughtfully. "Mother, have you considered that Marianne's uniqueness might be beyond cure?" "Nonsense! I refuse to accept that my daughter is irreparably dim-witted." She threw her hands up in frustration. "Why must I be surrounded by incompetence?" "Perhaps it's a question best pondered in solitude," Mr. Brocket murmured, earning himself a scathing look. "Fine! If none of you are willing to contribute meaningfully, I shall devise a new strategy on my own." She swept out of the room, nearly colliding with a side table. As soon as she was out of earshot, Mabel leaned the broom against the wall. "Well, that was a proper show, weren't it?" Marianne sighed wistfully. "I rather enjoyed the story about the candlestick." Isabella placed a hand on her sister's shoulder. "Of course you did, dear. Now, shall we retire before Mother conjures another scheme?" Catherine finally looked up from the window. "Do you think she'll be long?" "Long enough for us to find a hiding place," Isabella replied. Mr. Brocket unfolded his newspaper with a resigned sigh. Another peaceful day in the Brocket household. Mabel chuckled. "Aye, sir, real peaceful, like a storm in a teacup." They dispersed quietly, leaving the drawing-room as empty and dishevelled as before. Upstairs, Mrs. Brocket plotted her next move, undeterred by the morning's failures and ever oblivious to the futility of her endeavours. The afternoon sun hung lazily over the rolling hills as Mrs. Brocket marshalled her family into the overgrown garden. Weeds had overtaken what once might have been a manicured lawn, but she seemed impervious to the estate's dilapidation. Clad in a gown better suited for a royal court than rural environs, she surveyed her domain with misguided grandeur. An outdoor environment shall invigorate the senses and perhaps, at last, pierce the fog enveloping Marianne's mind, she proclaimed. Marianne twirled a wilted flower between her fingers. I do like the outdoors. The birds have such interesting things to say. Isabella adjusted her bonnet to shield her eyes from the glare. And what pearls of wisdom have they imparted today, sister? That worms are quite the delicacy, Marianne replied earnestly. Mabel trudged behind, dragging the broom through the unkempt grass. You want me sweeping the lawn now, ma'am? Do try to keep up, Mabel, Mrs. Brockets snapped. Your role is crucial to our success. Crucial, is it? About as crucial as a hole in me bucket, Mabel muttered under her breath. Catherine trailed behind, her journal clutched tightly as she scribbled furiously. Her romantic notions seemed undeterred by the absurdity surrounding her. Now, Mrs. Brockett began, positioning Marianne before a makeshift obstacle course, comprised of mismatched garden furniture and dubious-looking shrubbery. We shall conduct a series of social simulations to prepare you for proper society. Marianne blinked. Are we expecting guests? Metaphorically speaking, her mother replied impatiently. First, we shall engage in role-play to simulate sophisticated society. Marianne, you shall host a tea party. Catherine, you will be the esteemed Lady Worthington. Isabella, you are her daughter, Miss Worthington. Mabel. I suppose I'm the footman, Mabel interjected. Don't be ridiculous. You're a decorative shrub. Mabel's eyes narrowed. A shrub, eh? Fine. I'll just stand here and soak up the sun. Mrs. Brockett ignored her. Marianne, begin. Marianne curtsied to Catherine. Welcome, Lady Worthington. May I offer you some tea? Catherine, seizing the opportunity for drama, lifted her chin regally. Thank you, my dear. It is a pleasure to be received. Isabella stifled a laugh. Catherine embraces her role with the fervour of a moth to a flame. Marianne turned to Isabella. And you, Miss Worthington, would you care for a biscuit? Indeed, Isabella replied, though I fear your selection may be stale. Mrs. Brockett clapped her hands. Excellent! Now, engage in witty banter. Marianne paused. Did you hear about the cow that jumped over the moon? I do hope it wasn't ours. Mabel, arms crossed, muttered, This 'ere shrub's heard better jokes from the muck heap. Mrs. Brockett shot her a glare. Mabel, shrubs do not speak. Sorry, must have been the wind rustling me leaves. Isabella bit her lip to suppress a smile. Mabel's botanical debut leaves much to be desired. Moving on. Marianne, next, you shall curtsy to the Duchess. She gestured to a scarecrow adorned with a tattered shawl and a lopsided hat. Isabella coughed delicately. Mother, is that not the same scarecrow that failed to deter the crows last harvest? Nonsense! With a little imagination, it serves our purpose splendidly. She turned to Marianne. Proceed. Marianne approached the scarecrow and offered a curtsy so exaggerated she nearly toppled forward. Good day, Your Grace. Lovely weather for the crops. Mabel snickered. She's a real natural, ain't she? Mrs. Brockett shot her a warning glance. Must you persist in your mockery? Just doing me job, ma'am. Isabella jotted down a note. Marianne demonstrates acute observational skills, she wrote sarcastically. Very well, Mrs. Brockett continued. Now, engage in polite conversation with the Earl. She pointed to a topiary that had grown wild, vaguely resembling a misshapen animal. Marianne hesitated. Mother, is that not supposed to be a rabbit? It's an earl, Marianne. Do focus. She approached the shrub cautiously. Good afternoon, sir. Have you enjoyed any good lettuce lately? Mabel leaned on her broom. At this rate, she'll be the gossip of the town soon enough. Your commentary is neither needed nor wanted, Mrs. Brockett retorted. Catherine paused her writing. Mother, perhaps this exercise is a tad unorthodox? Unorthodox times require unorthodox measures, she declared. Now, Marianne, we shall move on to the waltz. She clapped her hands, and Mr. Brockett appeared, reluctantly emerging from behind a tree where he had hoped to remain unnoticed. Must I participate in this folly? He asked wearily. As the head of this family, your involvement is imperative, she insisted. He sighed. Very well. Marianne, shall we? They began a halting dance across the uneven ground, stumbling over roots and each other's feet. Mrs. Brockett circled them like a hawk. No, no, gracefully, Marianne. Pretend you're gliding on air. Marianne giggled. But father keeps stepping on my toes. Perhaps if you led, dear, Mr. Brockett suggested dryly. Isabella couldn't resist. A novel approach to the waltz, father, letting the lady lead. Desperate times, my dear, he replied. Mabel sat on a stone bench, fanning herself with a grubby handkerchief. Watching all this posh carrying on is right tiring. Back on your feet, Mabel, Mrs. Brockett ordered. The dimness won't banish itself. With a dramatic sigh, Mabel resumed her post, half-heartedly waving the broom in Marianne's direction. Now for the final exercise, Mrs. Brockett announced. Marianne shall demonstrate her proficiency in elocution. Do you mean I should say something? Marianne asked. Recite a passage from Shakespeare. Marianne's face lit up. Oh, I know this. To be or not to be, that is the something. Mabel clapped slowly. Bravo, a performance for the ages. Must you persist in your mockery? Mrs. Brockett hissed. Just doing me job, ma'am. Isabella approached her mother. Perhaps we should conclude for the day. Marianne looks rather overwhelmed. Nonsense! She is on the cusp of a breakthrough. I can feel it. At that moment, a distant rumble of thunder echoed across the fields. Catherine glanced up. It appears a storm is approaching. All the more reason to press on, Mrs. Brockett declared. Adversity builds character. Mr. Brockett looked towards the darkening horizon. Penelope, dragging this out, will achieve nothing but soaked clothes and sour moods. Fine, she relented begrudgingly. We shall reconvene indoors. As they began to make their way back, Isabella sidled up to Mabel. You seem to enjoy yourself. Can't deny it's entertaining watching the gentry at play, Mabel replied with a wink. Marianne lagged behind, picking wild flowers and humming to herself. Catherine paused to wait for her. Are you all right, Marianne? Quite. Did you know the flowers dance when no one's watching? Mrs. Brockett called over her shoulder. Girls, do keep up. We haven't all day. Back inside the house, the atmosphere grew heavier. The failed outdoor exercises had done little to improve tempers. Mrs. Brocket paced the parlour, her frustration palpable. This is unacceptable. At this rate, Marianne will be the laughingstock of Lesser Mudbury. Mother, with all due respect, the town hardly pays us any mind, Isabella remarked. Precisely the problem. We are being overshadowed by mediocrity. Mr. Brocket settled into his chair with a resigned expression. Perhaps, if we allowed Marianne to be herself, without these incessant attempts to mould her— Spare me your philosophizing, Henry. Action is what's needed. Mabel entered, carrying a tray with teacups rattling precariously. Tea's ready, though the kettle's on its last whistle. Can't anything in this house function properly? Mrs. Brocket lamented. Depends what you mean by properly, Mabel quipped, setting the tray down with a clatter. Isabella hid a smirk behind her teacup. Mother, perhaps we should consider a different approach. And what do you suggest? Acceptance. Mrs. Brocket scoffed. Acceptance is the refuge of the lazy. No, we must redouble our efforts. Perhaps tomorrow, Mr. Brocket interjected. The day has been long, and we could all use a rest. Fine, she conceded, though her tone implied anything but agreement. But mark my words, I will not rest until Marianne meets the standards befitting a Brocket. High standards indeed, Isabella murmured into her tea. Marianne entered the room, a crown of wildflowers perched atop her head. Look, Mother, I'm a queen of the meadow. Mrs. Brocket closed her eyes briefly. Yes, darling, quite regal. Mabel chuckled. Her Majesty commands the daisies, no doubt. That will be all, Mabel, Mrs. Brocket said through gritted teeth. Right you are, ma'am. She exited, leaving an air of defiant satisfaction in her wake. As the family settled into strained silence, the storm clouds gathered outside, mirroring the brewing tensions within the house. Catherine resumed her writing. Isabella flipped through her notes with a sardonic smile, and Mr. Brocket opened a book, retreating into its pages. Mrs. Brocket stood by the window, gazing out at the encroaching darkness. Tomorrow, she whispered to herself. Tomorrow will be different. But in the Brocket household, tomorrow promised only more of the same. A perpetual cycle of futile endeavours and unheeded lessons, all under the watchful eye of a matriarch blind to her own folly. The next morning broke with a rare burst of sunshine, as if mocking the previous day's gloom. Mrs. Brocket was already orchestrating her latest scheme, her determination renewed. Today we shall venture into Lesser Mudbury, she announced at breakfast, ignoring the collective groans that followed. A change of scenery will do wonders for Marianne's condition. Mr. Brocket looked up from his plate. Is parading her through town really necessary? Absolutely. Real-world experience is the missing ingredient. Isabella leaned back in her chair. Or perhaps the recipe itself is flawed. Mrs. Brocket chose to ignore the jab. Mabel, prepare the carriage. Mabel raised an eyebrow. Carriage, ma'am? Do you mean that old rattletrap with a wheel more square than round? Do I look like I'm jesting? Get to it! With a shrug, Mabel departed to coax the aging carriage into service. An hour later, the family found themselves jostling down the uneven road towards Lesser Mudbury. The carriage creaked ominously with every bump. Marianne gazed out the window, waving at passing cows. Look, they seem so content. Unlike some of us, Isabella muttered, holding on to her bonnet. As they approached the town, A plume of black smoke became visible against the clear sky. "What's that?" Catherine asked, concern knitting her brow. Mr. Brocket leaned forward. "It appears something is aflame." The source of the commotion soon became apparent. A small cottage near the town square was engulfed in flames. Villagers scurried about in a frantic attempt to quell the fire. Mrs. Brocket's eyes widened. "This is unacceptable! How dare such chaos erupt during our visit?" "Perhaps we should help," Marianne suggested. Mrs. Brocket scoffed. "And soil ourselves with manual labour? Certainly not." But before anyone could stop her, Marianne leapt from the carriage and sprinted towards the blaze. "Marianne!" her mother shrieked. "Come back this instant!" Isabella sighed. "Well, this should be interesting." Marianne reached the panicked crowd. "What's happened?" "It's old Mrs. Potts's cottage," a man explained. "The fire's spreading, and we can't reach the well in time." Marianne looked around and spotted a series of barrels outside the nearby tavern. "Are those full of ale?" "Aye, but now ain't exactly the time for a tipple." "Alcohol fuels fire," she mused aloud, "but water puts it out." She then noticed the large laundry vats outside the inn, filled with soapy water. "Everyone, use the laundry vats!" she called out. "The soapy water will smother the flames better than ale. Everyone, form a line. We can pass buckets from the vats to the fire." The villagers, too desperate to question her logic, began forming a line, filling up the buckets from the vats and passing them down the linears best they could, sloshing them over the blaze. Remarkably, after 10 minutes or so, the flames began to subside. Mrs. Brocket and the rest of the family arrived just as the last embers were extinguished. The villagers were exhausted, some clapping Marianne on the back. "Thank you so much, miss!" Mrs. Potts exclaimed tearfully. "A gallant effort!" The local magistrate approached. "A commendable act indeed. You must allow us to express our gratitude." Mrs. Brocket looked on, torn between disbelief and a grudging sense of pride. "Yes, well, even the dimmest candle can flicker brightly once." Isabella smirked. "Miracles do happen." Marianne blushed. "Oh, it was nothing, really." Mrs. Brocket stepped forward, swiftly inserting herself between Marianne and the magistrate. "Yes, well, as her mother, I can attest that such bravery and intellect runs deep within our family." "Of course," the magistrate replied diplomatically, recalling with clarity how Mrs. Brocket had demonstrated neither quality on several memorable occasions that had called for it. As they began the journey home, Mrs. Brocket seemed lost in thought. The others exchanged wary glances. "So, Marianne," she spoke finally, eyeing her daughter with cautious optimism, "what do you make of all this? Do you think you have finally come to learn a thing or two from your experience?" Marianne thought carefully for a moment, aware that all eyes were on her in what could be a defining moment. Then she replied slowly, "Mrs. Potts's cottage is certainly smaller than I remember it, though that may be on account of the fire." Mrs. Brocket's face flushed with a sudden surge of exasperation. Her mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air, words failing her. She clenched her hands tightly, nails digging into her palms. Upon arriving at the estate, Mrs. Brocket could contain herself no longer. The moment they stepped through the door, she whirled around to face Marianne. "It is perfectly clear to me that any semblance of progress in your dim-witted mind, Marianne, has already evaporated clean into thin air. she declared, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. She pointed a trembling finger at her. I think the only and best course of action at this point for you, young lady, will be to spend the night in the barn. Perhaps the company of livestock will instill some sense into you. Catherine gasped. Mother, that's unreasonable. Do not test me, Catherine, unless you wish to join her. Isabella shook her head. This is absurd. Absurdity is allowing this family to fall into disrepute, Mrs. Brockett snapped, her eyes flashing with indignation. Mabel, who had been lingering nearby, couldn't resist. Shall I prepare the barn, ma'am? Make sure the pigs know they've got company? Mrs. Brockett shot her a deadly glare. Just see that it's done. As dusk settled, Marianne made her way to the barn, a small bundle of blankets under her arm. The fading light cast long shadows across the overgrown grounds, the dilapidated estate looming behind her like a stern sentinel. Inside the house, Mrs. Brockett stood by the parlour window, watching her daughter's solitary figure disappear into the barn. She pressed her lips into a thin line, her reflection in the glass, a portrait of steely resolve. All my efforts, she muttered, all my sacrifices met with utter futility. Mr. Brockett set down his teacup with a soft clink. Perhaps you're being too harsh. Marianne acted bravely today. Bravery without intellect is like a ship without a compass, destined to drift aimlessly, she retorted. He sighed. Or perhaps it's your expectations that are adrift. She ignored him, turning away from the window. Mabel! The maid appeared in the doorway, her expression a mix of boredom and mild curiosity. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Brockett fixed her with a piercing stare. This situation is far from over. You will not be sleeping tonight. Mabel raised an eyebrow. What? Less than usual, you mean? Indeed. You are to go to the barn and, upon each hour of the night, whisper into Marianne's ear that she is becoming brighter and brighter, more and more clever, particularly as the sun comes up. If Dr. Mesmer can entrance the nobility of Paris, then surely we could attempt similar methods here. Mabel blinked, then let out a short, incredulous laugh. You want me to sneak into the barn all night, whispering sweet nothings in her ear? Ain't that a fairy tale gone wrong? Think of it as a form of subliminal education, Mrs. Brockett replied curtly. A necessary final measure to remedy her deficiencies. Mabel crossed her arms. Begging your pardon, but that's the daftest thing I've ever heard. Mrs. Brockett's eyes narrowed. Your opinion was not solicited. You will do as you're instructed, or you can find employment elsewhere. A sly smile spread across Mabel's face. Right then, as you wish, ma'am. I'll make sure the young miss hears every word. See that you do, Mrs. Brockett snapped. I will not tolerate any shirking of duties. Mabel gave a mock curtsy. Wouldn't dream of it. She turned and headed towards the door, but not before Mr. Brockett caught the mischievous glint in her eye. Outside, Mabel made her way to the barn, the cool night air filled with the distant sounds of crickets and the rustling of leaves. Whisper into her ear, she muttered. Might as well whisper to the moon. She pushed open the creaky door to find Marianne arranging her blankets in a cosy corner. Evening, miss, Mabel greeted, leaning casually against a post. Marianne looked up, surprised. Mabel, what brings you here? Looks like I'm here with you tonight, she replied. Your mother's orders? Marianne offered a small smile. Well, I suppose the more the merrier. Mabel chuckled. Couldn't agree more. She settled herself on a nearby hay bale, reaching behind it to produce a dusty bottle. Care for a drop? Helps pass the time. Mabel uncorked the bottle and took a hearty swig, sighing contentedly. She leaned back against the hay, the day's fatigue and the warmth of the liquor lulling her into drowsiness. Getting brighter and cleverer by the minute, she mumbled, her words slurring. Within moments, she was snoring loudly, the bottle dropping to the floor, causing Marianne to hastily jump out of the way. Back at the house, Mrs. Brocket paced the parlour, her anger simmering. Mr. Brocket watched her quietly. She was already plotting her next course of action, undeterred by recent events. "This family will regain its standing," she muttered to herself, "even if it kills me." Mr. Brocket sipped his tea, casting a glance out the window in the direction of the barn. "Unlikely," he murmured under his breath. "But one can hope."